Dear Professor, Your Excellency, dear and honorable academic community, dear guests, dear students. On behalf of Rector of Comenius University in Bratislava, Professor Univerzita, let me thank Professor Timothy Snyder, historian, writer, and an excellent analyst of the recent and current political development, focusing also on V4 countries, which is of our great interest, for his visit, and also to our colleagues and partners in organizing this event. We are proud to be a member of our democratic European family. However, democracy is not something what has been given forever. We should protect and develop it, we have to be active, and we should take care of its principles. We do live in dynamic and interesting times. They are probably the two biggest challenges in front of the EU ever: migration and Brexit. We are witnesses of the development in neighboring countries, and so on. Therefore, we appreciate very much to have the opportunity to take part in our today's discussion led by journalist and writer Martin Šimečka. Let me go to Professor. Everything happens fast, but nothing actually happens. Each story on TV news is breaking until it is displayed by the next one. So we are hit by wave upon wave, but never see the ocean. I very much hope that our discussion will also contribute to see a bigger part of the ocean. Dear Professor and dear Martin, the floor is yours. Welcome.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So introduction is already made, but I should add that Professor Timothy Snyder is an author of very important books in recent times, like Bloodlands and Blackguard, or On Tyranny, Lessons from 10th century, or just the last one, The Road to Unfreedom, which is now published in Slovak language. And and Timothy is, I may dare to say, a friend of mine for years, is now also not only a historian, but one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. So, I tried to, and first of all, I mean, in your last book, when you write about fascism a lot, writing about Russia as well, but can we start with that? Is that word, is this word fascism in our times something which is linked to reality? It's not only the past. How can we define the features of fascism which today are, well, important or similar to the past?
Well, I wish we could say that fascism is only historical. My own view is that partly because we've forgotten the history of fascism, it's come back. When we told ourselves after 1989 that there were no alternatives, one of those non-existent alternatives was, of course, fascism. But fascism continues to exist. Fascism is deeply rooted both in the human tendency to want authority and easy answers, and in the unsurprising reaction to globalization. So when you ask what links historical fascism with fascism today, one is the tendency to treat globalization as a conspiracy rather than a challenge. For the fascists of the 1920s and 1930s, globalization was a conspiracy, usually a Jewish conspiracy. For the far right today, for the populists of today, one again hears talk of the international financiers, or of George Soros in particular, right? Or in other versions, the Chinese, the Muslims. What fascists do is they take globalization and they put a face on globalization. They say globalization is not an objective process. That's loud. It's not an objective process, but rather it's a set of people. A second thing which the fascism of today, or the far-right movements of today have in common, with historical fascism is myth. So our president, I mean the ambassador isn't my president, he's not necessarily your president. Mr. Trump speaks of fake news. That's a fascist expression. In German, it's Lügenpresse. This is a direct commonality. What you do in fascism is you take the few remaining reporters and you call them the liars. And meanwhile, you try to fill the public space with as much myth as possible, where the two main myths are the unity of the nation and the unity of the nation with the leader. The main difference, I think, is that historical fascism really did attempt to redistribute wealth. It tried to take from some people and give to other people. Of course, it was taking from Jews and national minorities. Here in Slovakia, the far right, under Tiso, took from the Jews and to some extent from the Catholics and gave to other people. Today's far right is much less interested in redistribution. It's much less interested in taking from some and giving to others. It's much more interested in allowing the rich to become richer. That's a difference.
The other difference is that maybe in the 30s there were two ideologies which competed to each other, communism and fascism or Nazism. Well, communism was defeated, fascism was defeated also, but that's now rising again. So if there was a challenge, and liberal democracy actually was fallen between these two ideologies, who is now the biggest challenge to fascism as it was in the past, let's say, communism?
That's a wonderful question, because I quite agree with you. This is a major difference. Where is the left? I mean, not just the communist left. Where is the left at all? One of the reasons why we have such trouble seeing and analyzing the far right, or seeing and analyzing fascism, is that its natural enemy, as you say, has disappeared. The people who analyzed fascism in the 1920s and 1930s were very often communists or former communists, often, people from the left. And the fact that the left is so weak in Europe and in the US makes it very hard for us to diagnose fascism. Because the main response to the far right is to say, that's not really happening, or it doesn't make sense. So what liberals say is, this doesn't make sense, it's not economically rational. Right? That's the kind of response that, for example, President Obama would have had. This doesn't make sense, it's not economically rational, it can't last. But the people back in the 20s and 30s were aware that politics that promised radical visions or radical transformations could actually work. So I think that's an excellent question. I think today the natural enemy of the far right is something else entirely. The natural enemy of the far right is the truth. Because another difference between fascism back then and fascism now is that the fiction is all you get. So in the 20s and 30s, the fiction, the myth, had a purpose. The purpose was to transform the nation, to bring you to war. Today, the lying is all that you get. Back in the 20s and 30s, there was a big lie, a lie about a big conspiracy. Today, there are medium-sized lies about where a president was born, or about who shot down a plane. Medium-sized lies that are big enough to distort conversation and to confuse politics, but not quite rising to the level of ideology. And the only way not to defeat that is to fill up the public space with truth. So the natural enemy, I mean, if that's the question, the natural enemy of the far right today are the journalists, the historians, the translators, the people whose job, the educators, the scientists, the people whose job it is for us to see the world more like the way that it actually is.
Mm. That's why I think, well, I knew you already wrote in the book, and you about investigative journalism as something very important nowadays, and you know that in Slovakia was murdered. Our colleague Jan Picek and his girlfriend, Martina Kushnerova. Do you think that, well, we don't need to go in this particular case in details, but is it a broader picture of that, that even this, because of, let's say, fascism or authoritarian systems, they perceive and they see the enemies, so they try to kill them?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. There's a reason why it's dangerous to be a journalist in Russia. There's a reason why the President of the United States refers to journalists as the enemy of the people. And the reason is that leaders of that sort recognize where the problem is going to come from. They recognize some things which we should remind ourselves of. One of those things is that factuality is your only self-defense as a citizen. If you don't have factuality, if you don't have facts, you can't defend yourself because you don't know what's going on. Without factuality, you don't know about inequality. Without factuality, you don't know about pollution or global warming. If we give up facts and we say, well, everything's just a matter of opinion, then we lose, because there are people who are better at manipulating opinion than we are. Those people run governments or own television stations or pay for advertisements on Facebook. So we need facts for self-defense. We also need facts to recognize ourselves as citizens, because everything that citizens have in common has to do with the world around us and not just with our feelings about the world around us. When we go out and look for facts is when we find our fellow citizens. If we stay at home and stare at the internet and wait for things that affirm how we already feel, then we don't find anyone else. And we also need facts to have the future. Have you noticed that the future has disappeared? Have you noticed that despite the fact that we have more wealth and more impressive technology than the wildest science fiction could have imagined, there is no future. No one talks about the future at all, except for the billionaires. And they have terrible ideas about the future, like that they're going to live forever. That's a horrible idea. I mean, that they're going to go to Mars is a slightly better idea, but still bad. You know, that they're going to build islands in the ocean, that they have bunkers for themselves, but of course not for you. These are all, except for the billionaires in the audience, I'm sure you have your own bunkers. But these are all terrible ideas. These aren't ideas about the future at all. They just take up the space. Or the internet. The internet is supposed to be this grand technology that links you to the future. Then why, in fact, does it link you to emotions which we all had when we were living in caves, right? The future is gone. The only way to have a vision of the future is to have some sense of the facts of the present. So, because without a discussion of facts, we don't know what the problems are, we don't know what the challenges are, we can't think 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ahead. So, the people who want to take the future away from you, and the people who don't want you to have contact with your fellow citizens, and the people who don't want you to be able to defend yourselves, of course go after the facts, and they go after the journalists. Yeah.
Well, that's true that everybody's not, it's most about the populists. Mostly they talk about the past. I mean, if Trump says America great again, it means again from the past. And that's the same mythology for in Central Europe, the Polish government or Hungarian government now are talking about the past. As you write in your book, it's about the politics of eternity, which history is just recycling. And they are all the time victimized, or there are some threats from outside. The question is, what about the nation which has no past, like Slovak nation? We don't actually have a past in the sense as Polish or Hungarian people have, in the sense that while they have their big empires, we actually deny our own past, which was part of the Hungarian Empire. And in the 20th century, it's our only past. And there's nothing which we can go back in this fact. What about this?
I'm beginning to think that that's a tremendous advantage.
I think so too.
In all seriousness, because everyone else is going back to the 1930s. You can't go back to the 1930s. Russians and the Americans, the populists in France, even the people who like Brexit in Britain, they're explicitly or implicitly talking about the 1930s, which were, of course, the worst decade that one can imagine. But you don't have the 1930s. And I think, in some sense, that actually can be an advantage, that a state which is actually new will have more trouble abusing its citizens by talking about the distant past, right? So, I mean, Mr. Putin could talk about Kiev and Rus, but it's hard for Slovak politicians to mesmerize Slovaks by talking about the Great Moravian Empire, right? It doesn't seem to work, yeah. And I think, I mean, while we're on the topic, I think there are advantages to being small. One of the problems in both Russia and the United States is this tension between having to be a great power in your own mind and not being able to control events. The Russians have this problem, and we also have this problem. So that's what I think about Slovakia. I mean, the other thing I think is that it's extremely important to take advantage of the fact that one is a new state by getting the history right. Because if you get it wrong for decades or centuries, it's very hard to go back. So, I mean, as you know, most of the things that Russians get wrong about their history in 2018, they got wrong 100 years ago as well, or 150 years ago. Most of the things that Americans get wrong about their history now, they got wrong 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So it's very important for historians working today to say and do the courageous things when writing about the Slovak 20th century, because if you don't, the mistakes you make now will come back to you in 50 years or 100 years.
Well, we talk about it's good to have a new state, but on the other hand, in Europe, now you write about the myth or the illusion of national state is one of the biggest illusions among actually the nations. That nation state is a very short part of our history, and it has not very good chance to survive. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Okay, this is a tricky matter because I like states. I think institutions are very important. My whole argument in Black Earth, my history of the Holocaust, was that the Holocaust had a lot to do with the destruction of institutions. In that book, I made a point to say that even bad states are much worse than no state at all. So I want to be very clear that I believe that states are a good thing, and the rule of law is even better. And democracy and the rule of law within a state, even better. The question is, the historical question is, how can you actually maintain a European state? And this is where Europeans generally go terribly wrong. So this is the hard part. When I talk to Americans, it's very easy to talk about how the Europeans don't understand their history because Americans don't have any idea and they'll just kind of nod and laugh. And when I talk to Europeans about how Americans get their history wrong, Europeans say, oh yes, of course, those ignorant Americans, of course, they have their history wrong. But this is the hard part where I have to tell a room full of Europeans that Europeans get their history wrong. Okay, you do, and here's how. In essentially every European school system, and I say this as someone who's been teaching Europeans for 25 years, in essentially every European school system, in history, the basic idea is the nation state. The problem is that in the actual series of events that we like to refer to as history, the European nation state plays almost zero role. The only place the European nation state has anything like a long history is in the Balkans in the 19th century. The Polish, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Czechoslovak, Austrian nation states have a very brief history in the 1920s and 1930s. For the rest, European history is a history of empire. The main theme of European history from the 17th century, 16th century to the 20th is empire. And what the big European countries do, what the British, the French, the Germans even, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, what they do is they say they have a nation state so that they don't have to talk about empire or about losing empire. That's a trick, right? It's a trick. It's not the truth. So, to put it a different way, the basic European myth about Europe, which as an American we have to hear 3 or 4 times every day, is that Europeans have an old history of nation states. These nation states learned from the Second World War that war was bad, and so they banded together to create the European Economic Community, which is now the European Union. Does that sound familiar? Has anyone ever told you that? Because that's completely untrue. That has no basis in reality at all. Your nation states are not old, none of them. European states did not learn from the Second World War that war is a bad thing. If Europeans had learned from the Second World War that war is a bad thing, then Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Israel would be the most peaceful countries on the planet, because those are the European peoples who suffered most from the war, right? Europeans did not learn from the Second World War that war is bad. Europeans learned in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that they could no longer maintain empires around the world. The Second World War is for Germany a lost colonial war. Then the French and the Dutch and the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish also lose colonial wars around the world. When they lose colonial wars, then they come to Europe. And once you join Europe, you stop talking about your empires and how you lost wars and how you committed atrocities all around the world for centuries. And instead you tell the nice story about how you had a nation state for a long time, it learned from the Second World War that the war is bad, and hence we all cooperate peacefully with each other. That's a fairy tale for children. It's just not true. And the reason why it's important now, so important now, is that the Americans, forgive me, are no longer doing what we might be doing, I'll put it politely, to support European integration. And the Russian Federation is doing everything it can to destroy European integration. And so the false things that you believe about yourselves start to matter a great deal. The whole Brexit debate, which was referred to, was based on the false premise that there was once a Great Britain. There has never been a Great Britain. There was a British Empire, and then there was a Britain as part of the European project. There has never been in modern history a Britain which was neither imperial nor European. In that sense, Brexit is not a return to some kind of warm past. It's a complete experiment. It's a jump into the unknown. It's a walk off the cliff by people wearing blindfolds who don't even know they're wearing blindfolds or that there's a cliff. And this characterizes much of the debate about the European Union. Most nationalist politicians, be they Slovak or British or Swedish or French, it doesn't matter, portray the European Union as something which makes the state difficult. On the contrary, you've never had your states without the European Union, right? This is the longest period of not just peaceful and prosperous, but continuous statehood these European states have ever had. So that's the way the European debate should be framed, but it's not.
Yes, so I think, so that's your answer, how we should debate about the European Union. This, your last sentence is that we should actually see it as a project where national state is actually, it can exist only in European Union. Otherwise,
I'm very conservative, right? As far as we know, that's the thing. As far as we know, I'm trying to say that if you want to leave the European Union, you're conducting an experiment. It's an experiment in the unknown. For those of us who like to pay attention to the way things actually happen, this looks like a very strange way to frame the debate. I gave a talk about Road to Unfreedom a few days ago in America, and a British woman came up to me afterwards and said, I was offended by the way you discussed Great Britain, that it didn't exist. And I said, but what did I say that was wrong? She said, no, you were right, but I'm offended. That's the thing you can't afford right now.
Yeah, because now it's all about emotions and feelings. When Trump won his term, you had been warning that it's just a question of time when Trump will do something, a revolutionary step, which he will try to change America into whatever dictatorship. And you warned that American institutions are not as strong as many people rely on. How do you see it now? Is it the process of weakening American institutions and democratic institutions? Is it going on, or do they show that they still can survive Trump?
Okay.
You can talk, because there are not many Americans here, so you can talk about America.
Oh no, I spend a lot of time talking very freely to Americans, and two of the great things about America are that there are lots of people who speak freely, not enough, but lots. And another good thing about Americans is that they probably talk too much. That's one of the things that makes authoritarianism hard in our country, is that everybody talks, including the friends of the aspiring authoritarians. So, I mean, that's what, those are good things about us, that we talk. Okay. In the US, when something bad happens, we have two national responses. These are not written in stone, outside our embassy, but it's more informal than that. The first response is, nothing like this has ever happened to anyone in the history of the world. Right? That's what we always say. Everything that happens is always new. And the problem with that is that if you say it's new, what you do is you're intellectually disarming yourself, because if nothing like this has ever happened before, then you're helpless. No one can give you any advice. There's nothing in history to help us. And when Trump won, that's what a lot of people said, like, oh, this is such a surprise. And I hated that. I hated the idea that it was a surprise. Yeah, it's a surprise, fine, but it's a surprise that's a lot like some other surprises that have happened very recently. He's a figure who's very similar to other figures. We can use European experience, contemporary and historical, to help us figure out what's going on. The second American response after nothing like this has ever happened to anyone before in the history of the world, that's number one. The second American response to everything is the institutions will save us. And again, that is disarming. That's self-disarmament, because the institutions are you. In a democracy, the institutions are you. The institutions don't live some life out there on their own. If no one cares about them and props them up, if no one creates an atmosphere around them that makes them seem legitimate, the institutions will die. And they will die because people who are building authoritarianism know how to attack them. They know how to take the non-democratic parts of the democratic system and use them together. They know how to exploit the informal rules to push things the direction that they want to go. So I would say, to answer your question finally, how are we doing? It's very mixed. So the big famous American institutions are doing very badly. The so-called checks and balances are not really working. I feel like I'm making my ambassador's job every sentence a little bit harder. But they're not working. The big federal institutions, the Supreme Court is undergoing Gleichschaltung, basically. The Supreme Court is being formed in an image which is very far away from the middle road in American politics, and also very far away from, I would say, judicial excellence. And the Supreme Court is being deliberately framed in a way to allow the president to exercise unfettered power. So Mr. Kavanaugh, who's just been confirmed as Supreme Court Justice, was named because he's someone who thinks that Democratic presidents should be investigated for everything and Republican presidents should be investigated for nothing. It's a view I have trouble understanding, you know, as a matter of principle, but that's what he's known for and that's why he was chosen. So the Supreme Court, not doing so well. The Congress, I would say that the United States Congress had a duty way back in 2017 to ascertain whether or not our elections were in some substantial way influenced by a foreign power before it went on voting the things that it wanted to vote. That has not happened. The United States Congress has basically shrugged its shoulders and said, we don't mind if Russia chooses our president so long as we get to cut taxes. That's not an impressive reaction. I'm not impressed. That's not a check, right? Or it's a check written out to rich people, but that's not the kind of check that we were meant to be talking about. Sorry, English language pun. The translators can't do anything with it. I'm sorry. But there are some institutions which hang in the background of the Constitution, our Constitution, which are doing better, like the rule of law. So the basic idea of the American Constitution is that we are a country of laws, not men. And there is evidence that the rule of law in the form of judicial investigations is functioning. And then there's also the First Amendment to the Constitution, the one that guarantees freedom of speech. That is also functioning, not just in the sense that everybody talks, but in the sense that we have a renaissance of journalistic investigation, which has proved to be something of a check. And then freedom of assembly has allowed people to march and people to form new organizations and new non-governmental organizations to form. In that, those things have all been checks. But the checks that everyone thought or everyone thinks should work automatically are not working. It's actually been deeper ones and more surprising ones that have done some good.
In your book, The Road on Freedom, actually you have said it now that it's the candidate, the American president is a Russian candidate. And nobody is bothered by that, not nobody, but not the voters. And in that book, it's horrifying, I have to say, reading about Russia and you know, Ilyin and ideology of Putin, who rediscovered again the Russian mythology. Can you, in just very shortly, just describe the point of the Russian, this political fraternity? What is it behind? What is this Ilyin's idea and ideology about which Putin is now following?
Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the main thing which is wrong is that we don't have a future. That is the way, not you personally, I'm sure you have a bright future, but in politics, discussion of the future has gone away, right? This is, for me, the most striking feature of contemporary political discussion, that the future has gone away. And this is one of the reasons why young people are understandably depressed and put off. And the future going away is a result of some fairly predictable factors. And these things have to do with Russia. But I think it's important to see them as factors rather than to say Russia is the cause of all of our problems. Because Russia is not the cause of all of our problems. Russia reveals our problems. Russia summons our problems. Russia conjures up our problems and makes them clearer for us so that we can solve them. That's the historical function of Russian foreign policy. It brings out your worst self, and then you can say, hello, worst self. It's nice to meet you. So these factors have to do with Russia, but they're not limited to Russia. So there are three reasons why there's no future in Russia. The first reason is that Russia is a hydrocarbon oligarchy. That is to say, it's a state whose leaders depend for their position of power and for their financial position on the export of natural gas and oil. As a general rule, if you depend for your power and money, and this is not just Russians, it's also Americans, if you depend for your power and money on hydrocarbons, you really don't like the future, because the future contains global warming. And global warming is something that you really don't want to talk about because it's your fault, right? So if you are a hydrocarbon oligarch, don't talk about the future. Second reason, or second source of the disappearance of the future, is radical economic inequality. When there's radical inequality of wealth and income, then there is no social advance, right? These things go together. When wealth and income are radically unequally distributed, it's very hard for individuals and families to move forward. And that means that it's hard for them to think about the future. So in Russia, let me put it this way, according to Credit Suisse, which is a Swiss bank and not a radical left-wing organization, according to Credit Suisse, the only country which has more unequal wealth distribution than my country is the Russian Federation. Right? So in the Russian Federation, because roughly 50 people control a huge amount of the national wealth, it's very hard for people to think of social advancement. And for that reason, you have to govern without a future. And the third reason there's no future in Russia is the succession problem, right? Authoritarians are all sexy until they die. And the thing about the thing about the revival of authoritarianism now is that everyone seems to forget this, right? We all seem to forget. Xi's gonna die, Putin's gonna die, Erdogan's gonna die, right? They're all gonna die. And the whole reason you have a democracy in the first place is to avoid this problem of people dying. I mean, people continue to die in a democracy. I don't want to overpromise, right? That once you have full democracy, you will live forever, like the billionaires. But the point is that democracy solves the succession problem. That's what democracy is there for, right? It's to solve the succession problem. Russia has a huge succession problem because when Putin dies, no one knows what's going to happen. And you can't pronounce that sentence in the Russian Federation, right? You just can't. You can't talk about it. Hence, the future is off limits. So, when there's no future, how do you govern? You govern from mistrust, which is what the leaders of the Russian Federation have done with great skill. They have said, yes, we are a corrupt hydrocarbon oligarchy, which will promise you no social advance. And when we die, no one knows what's going to happen. But on the other hand, it's just as bad everywhere else. Right? This is the way Russian propaganda now works. Russian propaganda does not promise Russians a bright future. It just says everywhere else it's just as bad. Right? So sure, we lie, but everybody lies. In fact, there is no truth. There are only opinions, right? And since there is no truth and everybody lies, don't you prefer our lies to their lies? Right? And that's the 21st century test of loyalty. Do you prefer our lies to their lies? Right? It's not true just in Russia. Many of Trump's followers know perfectly well that he's lying all the time, but they prefer their own lies to what they think of as somebody else's lies. Once you accept the premise that everybody lies, that there's no truth, the whole art of governing changes. So this moves then into foreign policy. If you're in charge of the Russian Federation, and it's your job to say, well, things are bad here, but they're just as bad in Europe and in the US, how do you convince your people of that? Well, first you have lots of television propaganda which shows the worst sides of Europe and the US, but secondly, you try to mess up Europe and the United States, right? You, for example, fund internet news sites in Slovakia which foment suspicion of the European Union, or you use bots on the internet to help Alternative für Deutschland, or you lend money to the Front National, or you support Brexit, or you run a long campaign to support the election of Donald Trump to be president of the United States. All of these things have some common features. Generally, Russia supports people who deny that global warming matters. It's kind of interesting saying that. Generally, Russia supports people who are against European integration and against transatlantic cooperation. And generally, Russia supports people who are going to make a mess of things if they ever get into power. And now, so for example, I'll stay close to my country. Now that Mr. Trump has won, does the United States look more like Russia? Of course it does, right? We now have someone who is effectively a third-rate Russian oligarch, whose biggest ambition in life is to be a second-rate Russian oligarch, who pursues familiar sexual and financial patterns, I mean familiar to the average Russian viewer. We look more like Russia now. And that's the idea, right? That's the whole idea. So you govern from mistrust, and then you try to make other places look worse. And that, you know, that may seem like something which could be very difficult to do. But what I always remind Americans is this: the entire Russian cyber budget is probably less than one American fighter plane. Which one really changes the world? How are wars actually fought now? They're not really fought with fighter planes anymore. They're fought in the back of your brain. They're fought with the internet. The United States lost a cyber war. The faster we figure that out, the better off it's going to be for us.
Talking about that, does it mean that I've seen a wonderful lecture on YouTube about the internet, like how it makes us fascist? Has it a lot to do with the internet? I mean, is Russian partial victory, in a sense that they made us worse under the Russian influence? How much does that have to do with internet? Would be Russia so successful if internet didn't exist?
That's a wonderful question. So let me start with the myth of technology. Part of the myth of the end of history, part of the idea that there were no alternatives, was that the technology was progressive, that the technology was enlightening. So the propaganda about the internet is that the internet makes us smarter and puts us in touch with each other. It's just not true. I mean, there's the evidence, let's put it this way, the evidence is very much on the other side. The rise of social media has taken place at the same time as the crash of democracy. Exactly the same time. As the internet has spread around the world, democracy has crashed everywhere, except Africa. And that's because in Africa, internet penetration is very low. So if you're going to start from the idea that the internet was good for politics, the evidence is really not on your side, right? The evidence goes all the other way. And what I would say is that there's a reason for this. And the reason is that the internet, or at least social media, does not appeal to the parts of our mind which get us out in public and allow us to have conversations. The internet and social media instead work by finding the ways to the parts of our brain that like to be affirmed, right? The internet tells you what you want to hear, and thereby it makes you a much more boring, like to all those guys on the internet who are wondering why you can't get dates, this is the secret, right? The internet makes you boring. Or, I mean, for guys, it makes you more boring than you already were, right? So, we're already, it's already an uphill climb for us, and the internet just makes it worse. Because what the internet does is it makes you into a kind of cardboard cutout of yourself. It flattens you. It takes the things about you that were interesting and gets rid of them, and it makes you boring and intolerant and sure of yourself. And it helps you to confuse your feelings with the facts, right? That's what the internet does, or that's what social media does. So what the internet did for Russia was create a channel. So obviously Russia did not build Silicon Valley, Russia did not found Facebook. What Russia did was recognize that the internet allowed for a certain kind of intelligence activity, which is known as active measures. So active measures are when I try to use things I know about your psychology to get you to carry out actions that are against your own interest, right? So in intelligence work, there's intelligence, which is finding things out. There's counterintelligence, which is making it hard for the other side to find things out. And then there are active measures where you try to get someone to do things that really are not in their interest, like electing Donald Trump. So what the internet does is that it makes active measures very easy. If during the Cold War, the Soviet Union wanted to carry out active measures in the US, it would have to recruit people personally, or plant an article in a newspaper, or write some letters to the editor. It would be hard. But now, because people believe the internet, because people think it's theirs, because they trust it, which is crazy, because people trust it, it made it very easy for an outside actor to get into people's minds and incline them to do things. And it's all the easier because the internet isn't just a channel into your brains. The internet is also an advertisement of what you already think. So the way that Russia, and not only Russia, also Cambridge Analytica and probably other actors, the way that Russia used the internet was to play on what people already thought. So if you were a racist, I don't mean you, sorry, like if you were I have to do this so the camera understands the hand gesture. If you were a racist, then the Russians told you that Hillary loves black people. But if you were a black person, the Russians told you that Hillary is a racist. Right? So and the Russians knew, and Cambridge Analytica knew how to target these messages, because when you're on social media, you are bleeding information about your own psychology all the time. So what Russia did was use a very old technique, but they exploited the technology that hadn't been available before. And they did it in a very intelligent and effective way. And again, like the faster Americans figure out what was done to them, the better off we'll be.
I will give you a word for the audience, so just think about the questions in 10 minutes. Timothy, were you personally attacked on social media? Do you have this experience or you are not there?
I don't know.
You're just not on Facebook. You are. No. On Twitter, you are.
Well, so I mean, the way I think about social media is that the social media is there for people, right? Not the other way around. So what I think you should do on social media is, one, encourage people to read investigative journalists by posting the work of investigative journalists. Like if we all did that, that would transform social media. It would also help journalists to stay employed because the editors are counting how many hits their articles get. And real journalism is expensive. One of the funny things about journalism now is that everybody talks about the news, but no one makes the news. Only a few thousand people worldwide are actually investigating news stories at any given moment, right? There are about as many people watching this talk as there are true investigative journalists on the East Coast of the United States. So there just aren't that many investigative journalists. And so what I think we should do with the internet is to use it to share the work of people who are actually doing work. The second thing I think we should do on the internet is to tell people to get off the internet. So I use it for that. I think you can use the internet to help organize marches. You can use the internet to invite people to things. This event was, I'm sure, advertised on the internet, but the point is that it helps us to get together into a space. So I'm sure I've been attacked on the internet. Like I'm sure my Twitter feed is like full of all kinds of trolls and so on. But I don't really know because I don't really care because I like to live in the real world. I really like the real world and I like the humans and I'm on the side of the humans.
Great.
Yeah.
It's a good advice for everybody. There are a lot of young people here.
There are clearly a lot of humans out there.
As a historian, we face the problem that young people cannot imagine that something really bad can happen. Because most of them, as I see, probably born 30 years ago or something like that, so they live in peace and freedom actually, and in European, mostly European Union. As a historian, first of all, you can imagine that things can change to something very bad. The other question is, how fast can that be in your historical perception?
Yeah. So let me start with young people. It's true that I would put the responsibility somewhere else. Though I would say it's true that my generation raised a generation without history, right? Like the whole end of history business. Like if you're 20 now or 30 now, it's not your fault that people told you history was over, right? It's not your fault that the humanities are under attack all around the world, including the US. That's just the environment in which you were raised. So I'm quite hopeful, and I see evidence of this, that young people will use history and other humanities on their own, that the young people figure out that these are actually tools that you can use against the oligarchy. These are tools you can use against the people who tell you there are no alternatives, both positively and negatively, right? Because history tells you, as you say, history tells you bad things can happen, but it also tells you there's a huge range of possibility at any given moment, right? History is full of all sorts of things that did actually happen, and it's also full of things that were possible. So the more history you have in your head, the broader your imagination is, both about the bad and about the good. And now I know there was a question mark here, I forgot what it was.
How fast can these things happen?
Oh yeah, that's the really important thing. I mean, that's why I wrote on tyranny when I did, which was very quickly in a few days, and that's why I wrote Road to Unfreedom as quickly as I could, because I wanted to catch up, or rather I want us to get ahead, because the thing about history is that it's the only thing that allows you to get ahead of events. If you know something about the history of authoritarian regime change, then you know there are patterns. So you know that the whole attack on the press is a pattern, right? You know that that's a pattern. You know that people who are against democracy, because they have their economic interests in a way they're against democracy, that's a pattern, right? Germany in 1933 is not just Hitler, it's also a broad coalition of anti-democratic forces who didn't know they were going to get Hitler, but were against democracy and the rule of law. You know that it's a pattern that in a partially democratic system, like the US one, there's a risk that the non-democratic parts of it will coalesce, right, as they're doing right now. So the Supreme Court is the least democratic part of the system. The Senate is the less democratic part of the Congress. The Electoral College elects a president who lost by 3 million votes in the popular vote. Those are the non-democratic parts or the less democratic parts of the system, and they're coming together, right? So if you know history, you can see these patterns and get ahead. You can anticipate, not predict. You can't be sure about the details, but you know things can happen. And yes, they happen fast, right? They happen within a few years, but the key to the timing is, do you do something at the beginning or not? Because if you don't do something at the beginning, you very quickly become someone who says, authoritarianism is okay. That's the way it works. I mean, if at the beginning you say, this is okay, then your next move is going to be to say, well, that's okay, and that's okay, and that's okay, and that's okay. And we never really were a democracy, or democracy was always a joke anyway, and it's not my fault, right? With time, the key is, it's important that it moves fast, change moves fast, but with time, the important thing is, do you get into the flow of time because you think you might make a difference? Or do you let a couple of years happen? Because if you just let a couple of years happen, then you become the person who let a couple of years happen. And once you're that person, you're going to say, well, it's okay. I couldn't have done anything anyway, you know.
That's why you're writing the new book on democracy. Is it truth?
I'm trying to...
Secret?
No, it's not a secret. I'm trying to write a book about how things would be if they were better. That's what I'm trying to write about now. For the reasons that we were talking about at the beginning, like it's one of the things that we are starved of is a notion of how things could be better. You know, if you look at people who are in the public sphere, you have people playing defense. Admittedly, I'm doing that. People playing defense, and then you have people saying, "No, it's really not that bad. Everything's okay. You know, go to sleep." But what we don't have, which is weird in the whole history of the West, what we don't have is the third group of people who are saying, this is what a good society would look like, right? And that's part of how the 21st century authoritarianism works. 21st century authoritarianism, as you already said, Martin, like it's nostalgic, it pushes you back towards the past, but it also pounds you with the everyday. It hits you with the internet, it hits you with the tweets, it hits you with the news cycle, so that at the end of the day, you're exhausted, and you're exhausted, and you might be outraged, but you just have a lot of emotion. You don't know what to do with it. So part of the victory of 21st century authoritarianism is this starvation of the future. So what I'm trying to do is write a book about, it's about freedom actually. It's a book about freedom, which would be, the task of which is to show what a free individual and a free society would look like and feel like in the 21st century. So now you're going to talk about it, and now I have to do it, so thank you.
So, the questions, the floor is yours, so the audience, if there is already one, maybe there are microphones, may I ask you that first?
Volám sa Ernest Gezer. Chcel som sa spýtať, pán Snyder, v roku 2015 sme boli tu v strede a na východe Európy trošku zaskočení takým iracionálnym a naivným prístupom západných líderov európskych k ilegálnej migrácii. Čakali sme niečo také racionálne, účinné a nedočkali sme sa. Chcem sa spýtať, že či táto naivita a iracionalita bola taká úprimná, alebo či to bolo len také hrané. Ďakujem.
I mean, that's a question whether immigration, the politics of immigration from the Western politicians were naive, and why and so.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to the rational and the irrational with migration, I think we all need to take a big step back and look at ourselves. So one of the striking features about the so-called immigration problem is that the places which have the fewest actual migrants are the places where immigration plays the biggest role in politics. So in my country, Mike Pence, who's now the vice president, was talking about the threat of Syrian migrants to Indiana, which is his home state. Your American geography doesn't have to be too good to realize that there was never a threat of Syrian migrants overrunning Indiana. There were as many Syrian migrants in my kids' nursery school as there were in Indiana at the time that he said that. It's also true in Great Britain. So in Great Britain, people who voted for Brexit because they were afraid of migrants generally lived in the parts of Great Britain where there were the fewest migrants. And then likewise in Europe, I won't talk about Slovakia because this is all too obvious, I'm sure. So I'll talk about Poland. Some acquaintances of mine were trying to help Syrian migrants in Warsaw, which they were unable to do because there was not a single Syrian migrant in Warsaw, in the capital of Poland. There was not a single Syrian migrant in the middle of the so-called refugee crisis. 0 Syrians in the capital of Poland. So, meanwhile, in Polish politics, it was a huge story with Polish politicians talking about being overrun and the diseases and all of these terrible things that migrants are bringing. So when it comes to rationality and irrationality with the migration question, I think we all should take a deep breath. And we should all ask ourselves, are we being rational about this? Now, it goes back to these questions about the internet, because one of the things which goes wrong with the internet is the internet generally introduces you to the migration question in a very strange and perverse way. So lots of people who have had no real-world contact with Muslims, Syrians, asylum seekers have contact of a kind, but only over the internet. And the internet generally presents an image of outsiders, which is frightening, and so we're frightened of them, right? And so this is like, I'll answer your question, but this is by way of, let's all be a little bit self-critical about this question, because the business of us and them is the beginning of, right? That's the beginning of fascist politics, right? The us and the them, when we start saying, we're us and we're right because we're us and we're sure that they're them and they're wrong because they're them, that's a path which leads away from democracy. And the migration question can be used in that way. You can say, we're us and they're them, and we're healthy and they're dirty and so on. And that can take you to the White House, right? Mr. Trump, at the very beginning of his campaign, talked about how Mexicans were rapists. In fact, immigrants from Mexico are much less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans, right? Those are the facts. In Austria, a minister of government recently instructed the police that they should report on foreigners raping Austrian women. In fact, the vast majority of sexual assault in Austria, like in other countries, are people who already know each other one way or the other. But the idea was to portray the foreigners as the rapists and use anxiety as a way to create a sense of us and them. In early 2016, Russia effectively intervenes in German politics by creating a completely fictional story about Muslims gang raping a local girl. These are ways that this story of us and them is used to make democracy much harder because they get us talking about the anxieties and the fears. Okay, so that's just for all of us. On Chancellor Merkel, I think Chancellor Merkel was living slightly in her own world. I think she was thinking of the migrants as a way for Germany to address its own historical issues. I think there was a bit of blindness there, and I think there should have been more consultation before German policy moved forward as quickly as it did. I think that would have made sense. But in general, the migrant question, I think we all should the migrant question is a kind of test for us, right? It's a kind of test.
Thank you, first of all, for a very inspiring talk. My name is Maria Savakova, and I would like to ask you what's a very simple question. At the European Union level, we are fairly sure now that Russia is ended with almost all European elections. So my question is, do you have any recommendations how should states fight it? Do you think that there should be one common European strategy, or any European state should be left for dealing with this on its own? I'm asking because at the EU level there is this EU East African task force, and in my opinion it's a very small team of, let's say, 5 people now handling this issue of fake news. So what would be your strategy? How do we fight this? Thank you.
Well, look, I'm not going to give specific recommendations for what the European Union should do. I think, but I do have a few general ideas. The first is that the main way that outside actors influence elections is by way of the internet, one way or another. And so, I mean, there's a lot that can be done just in terms of basic internet hygiene that is not being done, just very simple things. So Hillary Clinton lost the election in the United States because John Podesta's password was password. If his password had been, my dog is named Rex, Hillary Clinton would now be president of the United States. So there's a lot of really elementary stuff which people get better at. The second thing that I would say is that in general in Europe and does John Podesta have any powerful friends in this audience that I should know about? Okay. The second thing is that the question for me is not so much defense as offense. So we're all thinking about how to stop the fictions and so on. It's very hard to stop it, but what one can do is support the positive side. which is, I mean, I keep coming back to this theme, but it's the investigative journalism and especially the local news. The key to keeping people living more in reality is to give them news about the towns and the places where they live. So in the long term, that's a more important strategy. I mean, the reason why Russia could reach into the American heartland was that the American heartland lost its local news. That's why. In fact, even going back to Russia, the whole story in Russia starts with the end of local news in Russia. So local news turns out to be extremely important. So in the long run, if I were Europe or a European country, I would be thinking about how you incentivize people to become journalists, what the form of investigative journalism is going to be, print journalism, whatever else. But thinking about that as part of sovereignty. So I mean, if we take the premise that wars are won or lost in the minds, which is not my argument, that's Clausewitz's argument. Clausewitz says, the most famous theoretician of war, he says, war is about breaking the will of the enemy. Combat is a means to that end. If you can do it without combat, why not? Right? Why not break the will of the enemy without combat? So if you think about it in those terms, then the internet or information becomes a question of sovereignty, which I sincerely believe. So, I mean, the way that I think about this is, now I'll be all conservative, the way I think about this is information sovereignty. If you want to be a sovereign country or any kind of sovereign entity, you have to produce enough information that your country has some chance of surviving an attack from the outside. I mean, you can think about it by analogy with energy or by analogy with food. We all know we have to have some kind of reserve, some kind of basic supplies. We might be in connection with the rest of the world for energy or for food, but we have to think of what the worst case scenario is. Information is like that, but only more so. You have to be able to produce enough of it yourself that you can get through some kind of an attack. So I think the idea of information sovereignty could be very useful here. So it's about basic hygiene. It's about treating as an example of sovereignty and creating the positive. And then I think the third thing, which is very important in the long run, is having European news. Right? You don't really have. I mean, it's pretty weak right now, and that makes it very easy for an outside actor to figure out which individual countries are going to go in on which issues. And then it's even hard for other countries to understand those attacks. So when a French television station is attacked, or when German public sphere is attacked, or when there's a tape scandal in Poland, other countries don't even necessarily recognize what's going on.
Another question? Oh, yes.
Dobrý večer, ja som Monika Ščerovichová. Ja by som sa chcela opýtať, že hlavným motorom vlastne fašizmu je dehumanizácia s propagandou. Dehumanizácia v podstate je využívaná aj dnes vysokými predstaviteľmi politickými. A chcem sa opýtať, napríklad americký prezident o novinároch, no a chcela by som sa opýtať, či existuje nejaká hranica, alebo teda do akej miery dokáže tá dehumanizácia znova otvoriť, alebo teda obnoviť fašizmus, alebo teda smery podobné fašizmu.
Yeah, the dehumanization is actually part of fascism, and how far this is a danger for today. The dehumanization Trump is one of those.
So I'm trying to think about what's the same and what's different in this question, because one of the things which is different about us compared to people in the 1930s is that we spend much more time in media. We spend much more time on the internet or on screens. In the 1930s, this is going to be a big revelation, people spent very little time on the internet in the 1930s. They were very disciplined. You could learn something from them.
They were listening to radio.
What's that?
They were listening to radio, which is another question.
But so a lot of the dehumanization that happens now happens by way of the internet. So people are atomized, to to use another important category from totalitarianism, people are atomized, they're separated from other people physically, and then they're presented with images over and over again, and they're generally images of what you're to fear. One thing which I find very striking about America, and then you can tell me whether this is true in Slovakia or Europe, is that in America, everybody is afraid of the same things. That's a bad sign. Like, fear is normal, but why are all white men afraid of exactly the same things at the same time? Like, that's a suggestion that, our fears are being prepared for us. It's also a suggestion that we're just too predictable, that our fears are being prepared for us. And the dehumanization that takes place is often, as going back to the refugee question, it's often of people that we've never even met, right? So when Mr. Trump speaks of Mexican rapists, he's not talking to people who know any Mexicans personally. He's trying to create this category. Now, the second thing I wanted to say is that the dehumanization is taking place on a very standard us-them pattern. In the US, the thing which is really striking, and this takes place in Poland too, is that the us and them is almost entirely inside the country. So Mr. Trump does talk about the immigrants and sometimes the Chinese, but basically the enemy is inside the country. The us and them is constructed inside the country, so that Republicans think a lot about Democrats, but they don't think, there's some exceptions, but they don't think very much about Russians. They don't. And Democrats think a lot about Republicans, but they also don't think very much about the rest of the world. And so an us-them has been constructed where, strikingly, American Democrats and Republicans no longer marry each other. They don't get married. Like, if you're a Democrat, you marry a Democrat. If you're a Republican, you marry a Republican. This is statistical, right? This is something new. But I want to push the point about dehumanization a little bit further, because I think the interesting thing about the internet is that it dehumanizes us without us being aware of it. It's not just that it helps us dehumanize other people, which it sometimes does, it also dehumanizes us. Like, what the internet does very well is it helps us find the kind of personality that works best with simple kinds of stimulation, mainly fear and anxiety. In other words, it helps us to become our most boring selves, but it also helps us to become our more animal selves, the part of us which doesn't really think so much, but which just reacts to stimuli. So I'm taking your question in a slightly different way, I know, but one of the things I worry about is the self-dehumanization, which takes place when we spend a lot of our time with entities that are not actually human, right? So we spend a lot of time with computer programs. We don't realize it, but we do. We spend a lot of time with entities that are not actually human. And I think that's part of the dehumanization that's taking place. It makes us harder, we're less able to deal with the heterogeneity of human life when we're instructed by entities that aren't human to become more and more, animals that are afraid. I'm overstating a little bit, but I think that is an important element of what's going on.
Okay, I have a question. There was some. Oh, no. I think there is a high hand there. Yes.
My name is I was a student of political department at Comenius University. You're a professor, and I have two questions for you. At the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned that we Europeans understand our history wrong. That the history of Europe was a history of empires, and the national states are illusions. And that leading the European project is basically stepping into the darkness. Does it mean that the future of European nations lies into the European federalization? That's my first question. And second question, in your book, Road to Freedom, you described that people of Ukraine, which proved to be much more resistant to Russian propaganda than American people, who have much stronger institution. My second question is, why is that so? Thank you.
So, with on your first question, I I don't think that it's necessary to prescribe any particular form of Europe. I think that in a way, you know, both sides of the debate have it wrong in different ways. The idea of ever closer union doesn't really make sense because the whole point of Europe is to have a state. But the idea of leaving the European Union also doesn't make a lot of sense because the whole point of Europe is to have a state. There's unfortunately almost no one who makes the argument like that, right? No one makes the argument that it's healthy for European states to have the European Union and it's healthy for the European Union to have states. That's the way that it is as far as I can see it. So I don't think you have to think of any particular form of European Union, whether it's more federated or not. I think the question is recognizing that the state owes something to Europe. That's the thing which is missing. And the imperial history is what blinds everyone to that because people want to think, well, there's always been France, but no, you know, there is no France éternelle. There was a French, there was an empire, and then there was Vichy, and then, you know, and then there was European integration. That's it. I mean, that's the only story. So that's the first question. Ukraine and the US, that's a really interesting one. So why did Americans fall for Russian propaganda when Ukrainians didn't? I mean, for one thing, Ukrainians know Russian. And in general, Ukrainians are perfectly aware of how Russian media functions. And so the tricks that are played do fool some Ukrainians some of the time, but they can't fool that many Ukrainians that much of the time. The second part of the question is that Ukrainians were confronting an actual military invasion. So for example, in March of 2014, when Mr. Putin tells the West that no Russians are in Ukraine, it's just people wearing camouflage outfits that they bought at a store. The Ukrainians are aware that they're being invaded by Russia. Like it's because they're being invaded by Russia. It's a hard thing not to notice, right? Like the Ukrainians were aware of these basic factual issues. If you're in Ukraine, you can tell these people are Russian soldiers because they're wearing Russian uniforms, they're using Russian weapons, they speak Russian with Russian accents, they can't speak Ukrainian when asked, right? It's pretty obvious what's going on. So that's the second advantage they had. But I mean, I think the disadvantages that the US had were that Americans were totally naive and still are, about how the internet actually works. So take the concept of fake, right? So everyone in America is now talking about fake news. That's actually a Russian word or a Ukrainian word. The whole notion of fake appears in Cyrillic before it appears in Roman characters. It's a technical term, right, which is used in Russian and Ukrainian at least 10 years ago, probably earlier. So, but Americans don't know that there's such a thing as planting false stories. Americans aren't aware that this could be done. So that's another huge part of it. And then the final answer is that Ukrainians are aware, we're painfully aware, that they were in the middle of a larger story involving Russia and Europe and America. And Ukrainians in 2014 were trying to explain to Europeans and to Americans that this is all part of one story. Americans, you know, they're wonderful people, but they're not aware that they're part of some larger story. Americans think that we are the large story, we're it. So the whole idea that some other country was messing around in our media was very hard for Americans to take. In 2016, I mean, when I looked at what happened in the US in 2016, I was looking at it from my Russian perspective, like trying to think, like if I were Russian institutions, what would I be doing? And I was looking at it from my Ukrainian perspective, like how is this like what just happened in Ukraine? And from those perspectives, it was very clear that something was going on. But living in the US in 2016, I was made crazy by the fact that Americans, A, didn't want to believe the rest of the world could possibly matter, right? I mean, what could be more dramatic than our own politics? What could be more dramatic than Republicans and Democrats, right? We just couldn't imagine that anything could be more dramatic than our own stuff. And there was something more dramatic going on, but we just couldn't imagine it. And then when it happened, here's what American journalists did. I love you American journalists who are watching this. This is what they did. They said, I want an American source to confirm this story for me right now. And you couldn't get that American source to confirm the story because it largely wasn't an American story. There were some American journalists, like Sheriff Frankel, who wrote about how what was happening in the US in 2016 was very similar to things that had happened in France and Germany and Ukraine and Georgia. But for the most part, what American journalists said when they were confronted by the possibility that Russia was interfering in our elections was, they said two things. I want an American source to confirm this. And I don't believe it because it's just an American government source, so how can I be sure, right? And so we were stuck. We were stuck in our own national narcissism. This is the part where the ambassador has to go. We were stuck in our own national narcissism. That was our big problem. Ukrainians have many, many problems, but they can't get stuck in their own national narcissism because they know that what was happening to them is part of a bigger story.
Okay, there was who is the owner of yes, that's the microphone. Oh, you okay? You have a microphone.
So in response to what I saw as the most important part of your talk, as someone, and that was about the disappearance of future. So as someone who was not really alive back when the future existed, is this thing you present an objective shift of the projections of the development of our societies, or is this a subjective shift of public discourse? And most importantly, how do we then get our future back?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful, wonderful question, and I very much like the way that you put it. Because before I answer, I'm just going to address the part where you say, I'm a person who existed back when the future existed. And it's true. Like, it is interesting, like, when I think back to the so I was born within a few weeks of the time that the Americans put a man on the moon. Could the Americans put a man on the moon now? Right? Could we do that now? I guess we probably could, but the idea, like, I was born almost half a century ago. The idea that we put a man on the moon half a century ago, that's really extraordinary, right? Because it meant throughout the 1970s and even into the 1980s, there was this notion that technological change in 3 dimensions was going to change the world, which it hasn't really done that much. Instead, the turn that was taken is that technological change no longer happens in 3 dimensions so much, it happens in 0 dimensions, or it happens on the space of chips that are so small, right, that we basically can't even see them. And these chips that are so incredibly small run the iPhones and the other devices which keep us staring at a world of 2 dimensions. So what was, so I'll stop this nostalgic thing in just a second because you'll probably come up here and slap me, but what was a kind of, the thinking about the future used to involve 3 dimensions. That was what, like, when I was younger, that was the idea, that like the 3-dimensional world was going to get better. Now, the 3-dimensional world is frightening because it's climate change and people prefer not to think about it or talk about it. And we get trapped by these 0-dimensional machines into a world of 2 dimensions. And that's part of this loop. So to answer your question, these things, as far as I'm concerned, are mental states and therefore changeable. The one thing which is not a mental state, and this is why I like it so much, is history itself, right? So in 100 years, if we're still around in 100 years, people can write the intellectual history of our moment and say, well, that's a moment when people's faith in progress shifted to certainty of doom, right? But those ideas, this is what I think is happening, this is what the whole book is about, shift from what I call a sense of inevitability to what I call a sense of eternity. Like, we're shifting from this notion that progress is a lie to this notion that everything happens over and over again. 100 years from now, people will look at that and say, oh yes, those feelings about time were ideas. Big, important ideas that we live inside, but still ideas. And as ideas, the moment you recognize an idea is the moment when you can change it, right? The moment you see, okay, I'm living within this sense of time, is the moment you can stop living within that sense of time and start trying to live in some other sense of time. So what I fear and what I see is that we're shifting without noticing from this progress to this doom, right? From this sense of inevitability to the sense of eternity. That's what I feel happening around me, and that's what the book is about. when I spent all that time talking about why there's no future in Russia, like that's what I'm trying to get at, that Russia is just further along in a process which is also taking place in other countries. But so for me, the beginning point of thinking about the future is to think in historical time, right? Because in historical time there is a future. Historical time says some things happen in the past, they constrain us, but insofar as we understand them, they also enable us, right? We inherit structures from the past, but if we see them, we can see our way around them, or we can see how we can change them in the present, which in turn means we have some influence on the future, right? So historical time gives us a version of time that goes forward into the future. It doesn't go into the past, like eternity. It doesn't tell us what's going to happen in the future exactly, like a sense of progress, but it gives us some sense of agency or responsibility for the future. So this is why I'm like, this is why I'm like, it sounds like I'm a kind of missionary, you know, from the dying humanities when I say this, but I really believe that a sense of history is the thing which helps us start to get a sense of the future. I think that's a precondition. But then another precondition, and this is the really hard part, is imagination. So I think we're now confronting the biggest disjuncture between technological and financial capacity on one side and imagination on the other that has ever existed. I think that's the most interesting and perhaps depressing feature of our world, is that we have all this, as it were, objective capacity over here and so little subjective capacity over here. And that's a part where once we start to think historically, we then have to be creative. Like we have to be able to say, okay, I'm not giving up. I understand there's no grand narrative. I understand there's no certainty about the future. But I'm not going to give up on the future. And here are some things that could be better. And these things exist, right? I mean, there are ideas like basic income, right? And I don't want to sort of hold a debate about basic income, but that's an idea which didn't exist a few years ago and now exists. There are ideas about how to deal with climate change, for example, which are real ideas. There are ideas about how, you know, people can live together. There are ideas that are out there, but there are too few of them. So we can't do it without imagination, right? So the whole last couple hundred years gave us these big stories. The communist story, the capitalist story, and we all know those stories aren't true. Or at least, I assume we all know those stories aren't true. What we, you know, and it's very easy as they crash around us. Like what's happening now is like the last crash of the capitalist determinist story, right? It's so easy to say, well, okay, I give up, right? There's no future. I'm just going to let people tell me who's the us and who's the them, and things are going to go around in a circle. That is easy. That's an easy place to go. The harder thing is to say, no, wait a minute. History tells me that something like this has happened before. And once you see that, then you can say, okay, if something like this happened before, that means I can do some of the happening myself. I can make things a little bit different than they are. And by the way, I would just mention in this, art is really important. Like art, poetry, literature, and music is really important right now because it helps us see what's so weird. It helps us see that things aren't either inevitable or eternal, right? So, and it's no coincidence that this particular historical moment, the humanities and the arts are taking such a beating because they're the only things which remind us that like we need to be thinking about the future and not just accepting that the future is this like. I didn't tell you what to do next Thursday, but like that's my best shot.
Timothy, I think that actually it's perfect time to finish because I mean that speech was about the future was excellent and actually very optimistic for all of us. So I thank you very much for coming to listen to Timothy, and I assure you if you feel that it was too short, Timothy will be next month again in Bratislava. In Central European Forum, we will have a panel debate, so we can looking for again for Timothy. And so thank you very much for coming and listening, and thank you first of all to Timothy Snyder.
you weren't wearing headphones and I wasn't wearing headphones, so it's like the Slovak language wasn't so important. But in fact, we all know that the translators who were interpreting were helping us a lot, so I want to thank them. And we also know that the translators of my books, 3 of whom are here, have made this occasion possible. So in addition to remembering the historians and the journalists as we've done, I just want to thank the translators. Thank you.